May 31st, 1916, in the North Sea, off the coast of Denmark. Europe has been embroiled in the First World War for 2 years. But today, 100 German warships designed to annihilate their enemy, the British Royal Navy, are about to change the course of history. Aboard the German battleship SMS Nassau is a 20-year-old enlisted sailor named Rupert Berger.
The feeling of tension before the battle is overwhelming. I pray for victory and our safe return home.
It is 5:30 p.m. There is no sign of the enemy. Suddenly, the alarm sounds. Royal Navy ships have been spotted about 19 kilometers away. They will soon be within range. SMS Nassau heels to the side. She has fired her first salvo.
And then, for the first and only time in the First World War, you get the full strength of both sides' fleets. And if you imagine the scene, you've got 150 ships on one side and 100 ships on the other, so 250 ships.
Never before has so much firepower been packed into such a small piece of ocean. Sailors on both sides know today will bring death or glory. Dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, submarines, destroyers. By the turn of the 20th century, European navies are launching a series of ever faster and ever more deadly steel war machines. To win the naval arms race, engineers and sailors use technology and tactics. They seek to see beyond the horizon, to aim faster and with greater accuracy, and to constantly push the limits of human achievement.
It was not easy to sink a battleship. It really wasn't. But to sink a battle cruiser, one lucky shot.
These formidable new weapons demand new naval strategies. And for the first time, war was being waged from the ocean's depths.
What was left? All-out submarine warfare.
This invisible threat can strike without warning.
There is a tendency for people to see periscopes everywhere. It's something that there's a visceral fear of submarines.
In a war between nations, warships on the high seas will hold the key to victory. Because whoever rules the waves, rules the world. At the close of the 19th century, the British Royal Navy dominates the oceans. Britain is the center of the world's largest colonial empire. 2/3 of its food is imported and transported aboard ships. It is the Royal Navy's job to protect these trade routes. In 1854, a 13-year-old boy boards HMS Victory, the iconic 3-masted veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. His name is John Jackie Fisher.
For the entrance examination, all I had to do was write out the Lord's Prayer, do a rule of 3 sum, and drink a glass of sherry. My first ship was the Victory.
Once the pride of the fleet, HMS Victory was built from 6,000 English oaks. But her days are numbered. Over a century of industrialization has revolutionized shipbuilding. Nine years after enlisting in the Royal Navy, John Fisher witnesses a major technological milestone. He is assigned to the very first British ship built with an iron hull, HMS Warrior.
The Warrior, our first armor-clad warship, would cause a fundamental change in what had been in vogue for something like 1,000 years. Unlike in the past, no human valor can now compensate for mechanical inferiority.
An ironclad hull is covered in thick armor plating that protects the most vulnerable areas of the ship. The hard metal surface deflects cannonballs, while an inner layer of wood helps absorb their impact. This combination makes Warrior virtually immune from enemy fire. And other maritime powers such as France and the United States are working on their own steel battleships. As he progresses through the ranks of the Royal Navy, John Fisher witnesses increasingly formidable warships emerging from the yards.
So what you've had is a period of breakneck technological change. The Royal Navy have gone from, in less than a generation, from ships that were made of wood, powered by sails and wind power, and armed with muzzle-loading cannon, to steel battleships.
John Fisher knows that any other navy with ironclad ships is an automatic threat to Great Britain. He sees in this an arms race the Royal Navy cannot afford to lose.
Great Britain must maintain command of the sea at all costs. Therefore, we must be decisively stronger than any possible enemy. The ships we lay down this year may have their influence 20 years hence.
Naval technologies have even developed to the point where it's possible to turn science fiction into reality. Across the Channel in France, another young engineer is bursting with new ideas. His name is Maxime Leboeuf, and in 1883, he embraces the challenge of conquering the ocean's depths.
I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when I was 10, and it fueled my enthusiasm and passion. I knew that the future belonged to submarines.
Leboeuf entered the École Polytechnique, choosing to specialize in maritime engineering, so he was destined to build battleships. Leboeuf was passionate about new ideas.
People have experimented with building submarines for centuries. But in 1886, French engineers build the world's first electric submersible. It has a range of 50 kilometers underwater, but then has to be back in port to recharge its batteries.
Until the 1890s, producing a true submarine just wasn't feasible. The vessel was kind of a long cigar that could dive in very improbable conditions by reducing its buoyancy.
Maxime Leboeuf's revolutionary vision is to combine an electric motor with a steam engine, like those used on surface ships. In this way, he hopes to kill two birds with one stone. The steam engine expands the submersible's range, while simultaneously recharging the batteries necessary for diving. But there's still the problem of keeping the vessel afloat above the waterline. Submarines must be round to withstand the extreme pressure underwater. But round submarines capsize on the surface. How to solve this problem? A competition launched by the French Navy in 1896 gives Leboeuf an opportunity to put his ideas to the test.
The program for this competition is relatively flexible. It's all about imagining a new ship, the making of which is left to the inventors.
In all, 29 projects are submitted to the French Navy. Leboeuf's proposal is particularly radical. He wants to make two ships in one. The inner rounded hull will withstand crushing water pressure. It houses the crew and equipment. This round hull is surrounded by a second hull, shaped like the hull of a regular ship. This outer hull provides stability on the surface. LeBoeuf's prototype, the Narval, wins the competition and is immediately put into service. This innovative design influences all submarines that come after it. While underwater, this new type of warship is largely protected from enemy fire.
Water serves as armor because though it is not as dense as steel, it is way, way denser than air. And anything that you shoot into the water is going to slow down. Missiles of any kind, bullets or whatever you will, shots, to the point that they're ineffective.
Submerged submarines are impervious to enemy guns. On the other hand, submarines are equipped with their own formidable weapons, torpedoes. These are propelled by a cylinder of compressed air and armed with explosive warheads. Once launched, they move stealthily towards enemy ships, striking them where their armor is thinnest. Maxime Leboeuf is convinced that his Narval will secure France's place among the world's most powerful nations.
The real way to guarantee peace is to give everyone the opportunity to be respected. The submarine offers a cheaper and safer way to defend against aggression from a more powerful nation.
Leboeuf's Europe is a tinderbox, waiting for someone to light a match. At the start of the 20th century, Europe is embroiled in a fierce arms race. In April 1904, France and England form an alliance. They fear Germany more than they dislike each other. And Germany is aggressively building a navy to match the most powerful army in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II dreams of having his own colonial empire, one that will surpass even that of his close relative, the King of England. Wilhelm's navy, a symbol of Germany's industrial power, has become his obsession. Meanwhile, in Great Britain, John Fisher, now First Sea Lord, believes that his king has underestimated the threat. He is convinced they must act to stop Germany, and fast. The Royal Navy may be the largest in the world, but it is scattered around the globe. Meanwhile, the German fleet is concentrated in the North Sea and Baltic. It poses a direct threat to British soil. Fisher knows that to continue to rule the seas, the Royal Navy must modernize at any costs.
He is a visionary. He's been described as one of those individuals who stands on that line between genius and insanity, and he sets out to reform the Royal Navy in a variety of incredibly dramatic ways.
He starts with the guns. Currently, British ships employ many different guns of different sizes and calibers. But Fisher has a revolutionary idea. Keep only the largest guns, because the bigger the gun, the longer its range, and the greater its destructive power.
If a man throws a glass of wine in your face, do not throw a glass of wine in his. Throw the decanter. And that is what I, as an advocate of the heavy gun, propose to do.
Fisher was the father of the most modern warship of the early 20th century, known as the Dreadnought, which literally means fear naught.
In 1906, the launch of this colossus stunned the world. It was, up to then, the largest warship ever built.
When Fisher launches Dreadnought onto the world, he is saying, we are going to tear up our fleet. We're going to render everything else obsolete.
Previous battleships had no more than 4 large cannons. Fisher's HMS Dreadnought has 10. She will thus be able to fire more than twice as many shells at an enemy as they can return. As with HMS Warrior, Dreadnought's vital parts are protected by thick armor. But iron has been replaced with something even stronger: steel. Assembling these behemoths is an enormous task. Each panel must be riveted to the hull by hand. The steel armor is harder on the outside and softer on the inside. The outer layer deflects shells, while the more flexible interior absorbs their impact. But building the biggest, most powerful warship wasn't enough for Fisher.
We cannot build for the moment. We are the trustees of future generations who may not enjoy the same serene sky as ourselves. We are on the threshold of a new era in naval construction.
For Fisher, the dreadnought was a choice of reason, but his choice of passion would be the battlecruiser.
Admiral Fisher is not content with having the world's most powerful warship. He wants the fastest one as well. He wants to take a copy of the dreadnought and strip away as much armor as possible. Such a battlecruiser, as he calls the design, would be much lighter and much faster. England's other admirals believe that such a ship would be too vulnerable.
Myself, I hate these brainy men. No brainy man ever sees that speed as armor. What these splendid armor bearers say is, give me a strong ship which no silly ass of a captain can damage.
But Fisher emerges victorious. Shipyards all over Britain churn out his modern warships. They are not alone. Other European nations have joined the naval arms race, such as France, and especially Germany, whose shipyards are building non-stop, catapulting the German fleet from the 5th largest in the world to the 2nd largest.
It was the prestige project that Wilhelm II pushed through. Many people were very enthusiastic. As in many countries, feelings of nationalism ran high, and a powerful navy was one way of showing that to the outside world.
Germany's meteoric rise alarms Jackie Fisher. He is even more convinced the Royal Navy must make a preemptive strike.
The only thing in the world that England has to fear is Germany, and no one else. England's guns must be pointed at Germany. I believe that war has become inevitable.
Fisher demands to launch a surprise attack against the German fleet. But King Edward VII refuses. Frustrated and disillusioned, Fisher retires in 1911. But the storm he predicted looms on the horizon. The war that Fisher foresaw begins on July 28, 1914. Germany and its allies march on Serbia, Russia, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. Anticipation grows for the long-predicted clash between the German High Seas Fleet and the Royal Navy. But neither side is willing to gamble with their fleet. Instead, Britain opts for a time-honored tactic: a naval blockade, deploying the bulk of their fleet to Scapa Flow, Scotland, and the English Channel.
Where were the lines of dreadnoughts facing off against one another? Where was the decisive battle? The early part of the 20th century was devoted to building superb and costly fleets, increasing gun calibers, bolstering protection, ramping up speed, just to set up a blockade?
With this blockade, the Royal Navy hopes to neutralize the German fleet by trapping it in the North Sea. And just as importantly, the blockade will prevent merchant ships from reaching Germany. This will deprive the Germans of raw materials and weapons, and food.
What's immoral about it is that blockades essentially attack civilians. In Germany, that first pick of the food went to the army. And then there was a hierarchy, so that civilians in general suffered most. from hunger.
With its battleships penned in the North Sea, Germany has one hope to turn the tables on the British fleet: submarines. On February 4th, 1915, the Germans unleashed the full potential of this previously untested weapon. In the waters near the British Isles, German U-boats sink every merchant ship within range.
The Germans did not have the capital ships to do the same thing to England, but they had submarines. And what they could do was, people could hardly even try to get to Germany. They could try to get to England, but at the height of success of the German submarine efforts, a quarter of the ships going to England were making one-way trips.
The attack causes British merchant ships to panic. It also provokes the ire of French engineer Maxime Leboeuf, who sees his distinctive double-hull design reflected in the lethal German U-boats.
It's not for me to speculate on how the Germans got hold of my plans, but it is the only possible way for them to have built operational submarines so quickly.
Leboeuf's narval had no real way of seeing underwater. But the German U-boats are equipped with modern periscopes. With these, they become formidable weapons. Lurking beneath the surface, they are undetectable. To kill, they only have to close in and fire.
And there's no weapon to attack a submarine underwater. I mean, you get quite ridiculous techniques early in the First World War, but all sorts of bizarre ideas for climbing on a submarine's periscope and sticking a hand grenade on the periscope. They literally have no means of sinking a submarine when it's underwater.
Submarines have proven how valuable they can be, but the Germans simply don't have enough of them. So they ramp up production and begin recruiting new crews. One of these new recruits is Lothar de la Perrière. Age 29, he spends the early part of the war stuck behind a desk.
I wanted to go. I wanted to go immediately, before it was too late. But not until the spring of 1915 did I succeed in enlisting in the submarine forces.
While Lothar de la Perrière completes his training, German U-boats continue terrorizing enemy vessels. May 7th, 1915, off the coast of Ireland. German submarine U-20 spots Lusitania, a British steamship on its way from New York to Liverpool. At 2:10 p.m., U-20 fires a torpedo. 18 minutes later, Lusitania disappears into the abyss. 1,198 passengers and crew drown. Propaganda fuels a massive wave of outrage in Europe and inspires a new kind of terror.
There is a tendency for people to see periscopes everywhere because it's that kind of unseen menace. It's a threat that you can't see, I guess like disease. It's something that there's a visceral fear of submarines.
The United States is furious. 128 of the Lusitania victims are American nationals. Newspapers called the sinking an act of German barbarism. And footage from the funerals plays on newsreels nationwide. America, which had remained neutral so far, threatens to join the war. Rather than face the Americans, Germany agrees to new rules for using submarines.
According to the prize law, a merchant ship had to be stopped, searched and looked at to see what was on it. If there is ammunition on it, then it is clearly war material. One was allowed to destroy and sink it, but you had to make sure that the crew was rescued before you were allowed to sink the ship.
Practically speaking, to perform a search, a submarine must come to the surface. But a submarine above the water is vulnerable to attack. German U-boats also patrol the Mediterranean, where many British merchant ships transit supplies from the colonies. The U-boats are based at Pola, an Adriatic port governed by Germany's Austro-Hungarian allies. There are far fewer American ships in these waters. This is where Lothar de la Perrière is posted when he completes his training. When he arrives, the former desk clerk is told to limit his expectations.
The flotilla commander told me, "You don't need to sink anything. Just bring the boat back in one piece."
Lothar assumes command of U-35. At 65 meters, it is almost twice as long as the French Narval. Equipped with 4 torpedo tubes, it can remain submerged for 16 hours straight. To protect itself at the surface, it has a gun on deck. In January 1916, Lothar de la Perrière is finally sent out on a mission in the Mediterranean. He is just in time to experience new anti-submarine countermeasures. On January 17th, U-35 spots a cargo ship sailing under an enemy flag. After halting it with a warning shot, Lothar de la Perrière dispatches his men to search it.
I dived and approached very carefully, raising the periscope. We surrounded the steamboat 100 meters away. On board, nothing moved. The name Melanie was written across the bow. I gave the order to surface. Suddenly, all hell broke loose as depth charges began to explode above our heads.
It's a trap. This cargo ship is a decoy, armed to the teeth and hunting German submarines.
It was a British idea to arm merchant ships and conceal the weapons. The ship looks like a completely harmless cargo vessel. Then, as the German submarine surfaces, the guns are exposed and fired.
Q-ships are a very underhand weapon. And actually, when you start to get into those kind of ethical discussions around the rules of war, can we really blame the Germans for sinking from a submerged position when there's a risk that the ship they're attacking might well be a disguised Q-ship?
Concealing weapons of war aboard merchant vessels is against the rules of naval combat. But these decoy ships are highly effective. Their machine guns can easily pierce the armor of a submarine sitting on the surface. Lothar de la Perrière and his men managed to escape, this time. They know they may not be so lucky again. After 2 years in the North Sea, the British blockade is working as intended. Germany is slowly starving. Food imports are cut off. Fertilizer shortages have led to crop failures. Famine looms. Germany's mighty battleships can't remain on the sidelines any longer. No matter the risk to the fleet, they must try and break the blockade.
The Germans wait for years. In Germany, it's known as Der Tag, the day, when they will steam out of their bases and fight the Royal Navy and win control of the oceans.
May 31st, 1916. Der Tag has come. The entire German high seas fleet, 99 ships in all, set sail. The ships communicate with each other with flag signals and searchlights. They also have radios, but these are not used on the high seas, because the Royal Navy could intercept the radio messages. And the sailors, like Rupert Berger, know that surprise is their only chance against the still superior Royal Navy.
All we know is that there is an English squadron along the Norwegian coast. We need to intercept it and sink it. The feeling of tension before the battle is overwhelming.
First, they must find the enemy. Using binoculars, German sailors scour the horizon for any sign of the British fleet. From the highest vantage point aboard ship, the horizon is 15 kilometers away. In optimal conditions, the outline of an enemy ship can be seen up to 30 kilometers away. Nevertheless, at 1,000 kilometers long and 600 kilometers wide, there is a lot of room to hide a fleet in the North Sea. But it is coincidence that brings the fleets together.
A passing Danish fishing boat was sighted by both the Royal Navy and the Imperial German Navy. Each fleet decided to check it out. When they approached, they found themselves face to face with one another.
Shortly after 5:30 p.m., the German lookouts spot the British squadron. Moments later, Rupert Berger hears the alert sound on the bridge.
I had just climbed up on deck when the battle stations were sounded across the ship. Enemy in sight. But for us, they were still out of range.
Calculate firing distance. The Germans, like the British, have powerful rangefinders. Instruments composed of 2 telescopes, several meters apart.
The rangefinder is a giant pair of binoculars or a giant telescope. Collects data. From that data, you can estimate how far away the target is and what speed it's doing and maybe what course it's traveling.
Viewed through the eyepiece, the 2 images of the target are split. All the operator has to do is turn the device's dial until the 2 images merge. The rangefinder then indicates the distance from the target. The gunners use this information to aim with extreme precision before firing.
It is precisely 6:43 a.m. We have just fired our first salvo.
The German plan works. The High Seas Fleet has indeed managed to take an English squadron by surprise. 22 German dreadnoughts and battlecruisers open fire. The British only have 4 dreadnoughts and 6 lightly armored battlecruisers.
It was not easy to sink a battleship. It really wasn't. But to sink a battlecruiser, one lucky shot. In one day, the commander of the British battle cruiser fleet lost half of them. Half of them. Boom. They blew up in seconds. What he said after the second one went, said, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today."
For the German ships, victory seems within reach. They know that this is the battle for which their ships were built, for which they were trained. Soon, the smoke from their cannons is so thick that they can hardly see. But as the German ships emerge from this smoke, the sailors see more British ships on the horizon. Many, many more.
Suddenly, heavy artillery fire. Left and right, in front and behind us. Heavy grenade impacts. We could only see the enemy by their muzzle flashes. Somehow, the whole fleet had joined the battle.
And that's the point where it starts to go wrong for the Germans, because for all the damage they're doing, and they are doing a lot of damage to the British fleet, when they see the full might of the Grand Fleet, that numbers game comes into play again, and they realise that it's a battle they absolutely cannot win.
The Germans have no choice but to flee into the twilight. and to hope that night falls swiftly enough to keep them safe out of the sights of the British gunners. When dawn breaks, they are long gone. Back on land, the Germans claim victory. They sank more ships than they lost. This is true, but it doesn't acknowledge the Royal Navy has enough ships to absorb their losses, and then some. The Germans' attempt to turn the tide of the war has failed.
The plan was as good a plan as they could devise. It's just not good enough. There's no better opportunity. There's nothing else they could have done. They did everything they could have done to try and make it work. They just don't have the numbers.
The decisive battle had been a failure. The Royal Navy failed to destroy the Imperial German Navy, which had attacked the Royal Navy, but likewise failed to destroy or weaken its adversary. What was left? All-out submarine warfare.
Where surface ships had failed, it is possible U-boats could succeed. By the end of 1916, in just 10 months, Lothar de la Perrière alone has sunk 121 merchant ships in the Mediterranean. He is now an expert at spotting ships used by the Allies to illicitly transport soldiers or war material. On October 16th, a French steamship crosses his path.
It was beautiful that day, south of Sardinia. We were about to sit down for a Sunday coffee when I was informed that a large 3-funnel steamboat had been spotted.
U-35 is not allowed to attack, only cautiously approach ships to search them and look for anything suspicious.
My gut feeling was that this was a personnel carrier. Fire torpedo! Everyone aboard held their breath.
His intuition was right. SS Gallia is carrying 2,350 French and Serbian soldiers and crew. More than 600 of them drowned. It is the third greatest loss of life at sea during the war. Lothar, who is filmed for propaganda purposes, is hailed as a hero. On February 1st, 1917, German High Command announces the resumption of all-out submarine warfare. From this point on, German submarines will indiscriminately and without warning sink any ships bound for Britain. Taking a page from the enemy's playbook, they hope to starve Britain into ending the war.
It was a gamble in 1917. Can we take England out before the United States not enters the war, but gets enough troops over here to make a difference? And the decision was, we got to try.
We much prefer to fight against warships, but the destruction of enemy merchant ships is infinitely more useful to the achievement of our success. In 4 weeks, we have sunk 56 of them.
The resumption of all-out submarine warfare unleashes a huge wave of protests in the United States. But President Woodrow Wilson is reluctant to fully commit his country. He decides to secretly send one of his best admirals to London, a man named William Sims.
I was directed to sail on a merchant vessel, to travel under an assumed name. On reaching the other side, I was to immediately send to Washington detailed reports on prevailing conditions.
The American admiral quickly realizes just how dangerous the Atlantic crossing is. German submarines are by now sinking a quarter of all British-bound shipping.
It became clear that the Germans were not losing the war, they were winning it. Unless the appalling destruction of merchant shipping could be checked, the unconditional surrender of the British Empire would inevitably take place within a few months.
In 1917, German submarines were sinking ships at a faster rate than the British could build them.
On April 6th, the United States finally declares war on Germany. But Sims is worried his country might be on the losing side. But when thinking about how to neutralize German U-boats, he realizes the solution is already there.
The German submarines had been attempting to sink great battleships one by one. Had this pretentious scheme succeeded? The fact was that the submarines had not destroyed a single dreadnought.
British dreadnoughts are mighty battleships, but they are never alone at sea. Instead, they are always escorted by destroyers. What these smaller ships lack in size, they make up for in speed.
Destroyers are well armed, they're fast, they can both protect the convoy and they can hunt a submarine, and they can move around that convoy and respond to a target very quickly.
Destroyers can reach speeds of over 35 knots, or nearly 70 kilometers an hour. This is more than twice as fast as German U-boats. Once a U-boat is spotted on the surface, a destroyer can reach its target in an incredibly short time. And if the U-boat dives to escape, destroyers have a weapon for that: depth charges.
A depth charge is dropped into the water and set to explode at the depth where the submarine lurks, 30, 40 or 50 meters down. It is dropped into the water in the vicinity of the submarine, and then 40 to 45 meters down, it explodes.
Depth charges are bombs that explode underwater. Their firing mechanism is set to a pre-selected depth. Once that is reached, it detonates. The depth charge doesn't have to actually hit the submarine. The shock wave from the blast alone can sever power lines on board or cause the sub to leak. For a submarine crew, a hole in the hull means they are doomed to sink. The American Admiral Sims does some calculations. The English have 200 destroyers to protect at least 1,000 merchant ships every month. It isn't enough. Then Sims has an idea.
Battleships proceed in a close formation or convoy. Why not apply this same principle to merchant ships? If destroyers can keep the submarines away from battleship convoys, they can do the same with convoys of merchant ships.
By clustering merchant ships together, Sims hopes to reduce their chances of being found by German U-boats.
Convoys are hard to find. The ocean's a big place. Finding a needle in a haystack is very hard. Finding a thimble in a haystack is not that much easier.
From the first ship to the last ship, convoys extend over 20 kilometers. This is a mere speck in the North Atlantic, which is 3,000 kilometers wide. The first of these convoys sailed in May 1917. It gets through without losses. Thanks to the convoys, within 3 months, losses of merchant ships fall by almost 3/4. The German move to win the war at sea has failed, and worse still, it has made the United States an enemy. A year and a half later, in October 1918, the German Admiralty orders its fleet to leave port for a final, do-or-die offensive. But the German sailors are no fools. They know they are no match for the Royal Navy. They know it is a suicide mission.
A whisper went through the ship. This time, we're all going to die. Every last man. No one will come back alive. It's incomprehensible. I didn't come through 4 years of war only to be blown to bits now.
German sailors refuse to die for a lost cause. Within days, they take over first their ships, then the naval bases. The uprising spreads at breakneck speed and becomes a revolution. On November 8, 1918, the German government requests an armistice. The victors impose strict conditions.
For the British, the German fleet is the cause of the war. It's the single most important cause of the war for the British. It was the single thing that they wanted to deal with.
With an armistice in place, German sailors prepare their ships for departure. Not for home, but for Scotland and internment.
We're one of the ships that will be interned. If we haven't left port by the morning of November the 18th, England will occupy Helgoland, Kiel and Hamburg. As to whether we will get our ships back, that's the big question.
The German High Seas Fleet goes on its last voyage to Scapa Flow in Scotland. Here, under the guns of the Royal Navy, the German sailors await their fate. Winning the war had not been in the cards for them, but they would have one last chance to go down in history. For Rupert Berger, the war is over. He would go on to serve in the next. Maxime Leboeuf continues to build submarines. Lothar de la Perrière rises to admiral in Hitler's Kriegsmarine. William Sims became the only naval career officer to win a Pulitzer Prize. And John Fisher spent the war chairing a Royal Navy committee on inventions and research.